Welcome to the training webinar for this, the 60th anniversary. I'm sorry, the 80th anniversary of the Allied landings on D-Day on June 6th, 1944. 80 years ago, a operation in which my grandfather participated. Welcome to the training webinar. Today, we are going to talk about permissions and get into a fair amount of detail on permissions in Process Director and how they work. So without further ado, let's get into it. Every object in Process Director, every form, every timeline, every instance, every document attachment has permissions that are associated with them. I was about to say permissions can be associated with them, but that's not true. Permissions are associated with them. It is impossible to have an object that doesn't have permissions. All of the permissions, by the way, are stored in the Process Director database. If we go into the documentation and we look at the page for table definitions in the Process Director database, the table permissions are in their own separate table. It's called table perm, and every permissions record in table perm is associated with a content list object somewhere in the system. As a system administrator, you can get an overview of the permissions simply by going to the Object Perms page in your Process Director installation, which allows you to search a particular partition, a folder, search for a particular object, an object type, or to search for a particular user to see what permissions they might have on the system. In this particular case, I have set the object permissions search feature to look in the default partition and look at all the forms and return all of the forms along with their associated permission. As you can tell, most of my permissions are exactly the same for pretty much everything, which may not be the case in your default installation. Every object has permissions so that we can determine who is allowed to look at different objects in our system. When we refer to object permissions like these, which are the permissions that are placed on an object, we're also referring, at least by implication, about user permissions, because each object has permissions, and those permissions are set per user, or at least per user class. If I was to go into a random folder, so here is the webinar folder for today's webinar, and I were to go into its properties, there is a permissions tab, and every object in Process Director has a permissions tab. We're going to look at this tab a lot closer a little bit later, but up here at the very top in the Add Permissions section, there is a drop-down, and it enables you to specify the users to whom you would like to grant permissions to an object. Some are specific users. For example, I can choose a specific user or a specific group, and I can identify those users by name, either directly by choosing specific user or by indirectly, by implication, by choosing a specific group, which whatever permissions I give to that group will automatically be applied to all users who are members of that group. There are also some other items here that don't refer to specific users, but rather classes of user. For example, I have anonymous users, users who don't have an identity in Process Director, or process users, which will include at various times anyone who is currently an active participant in a process. So if I assign something to say process users, a permission to process users, a regular user may not be a part, may not ever have those permissions because they never participate in a process. If they do participate in a process, they will have those permissions during the period of time that they are actively participating in a process, which is to say they will be granted temporarily while I'm a member of the process users class, which is to say I'm an active participant in a process. I have a task assigned to me. And as soon as that task is complete, I'm no longer a member of process users, and thus I lose all of those permissions. I said permissions apply to everyone, but that's not quite true. Because in Process Director, if we go into user administration, and let's go ahead and find Diana, and let's open up her user account. Diana is a system administrator. System administrators automatically receive exemptions to all permissions in the system. System administrators have unlimited access to the entire system. So irrespective of what permissions may be set on the system, if you are designated as a system administrator, you have full administrative control over the entire Process Director installation. Similarly, if you are a system partition admin, you are given an exception for all permissions that are assigned within the partitions of which you are a member. In most cases, most installations of Process Director do not have multiple partitions. There is a single partition. So if you make someone a system partition admin, they will, in effect, have full control over the entire content list of your system, since they're a member of the one partition that exists on your system. For more complex implementations, which is to say systems that may have multiple partitions, like this system here, I have several different partitions so that other users can occasionally go in and use the system inside their own partition without messing with my partition. Well, since I have all of these different partitions, I can create partition administrators for one or more of these partitions. If you are a partition administrator, then for the partitions to which you're assigned, none of the permissions that are placed inside the content list for content list objects will apply to you. Now, I don't need to make Diana a system partition admin because she is, of course, a system administrator. And being a system administrator, she already has full exemption from all of the user permissions that might be applied to any folder in the system. So let's go back to our folder and let's go back to the permissions tab. And let's take a closer look at that. Process Director uses a permissive access model. And what that means is that whether you're allowed access to a particular form or process timeline or what have you, is dependent on the permissions that you are granted inside each of those permissions. By default, whenever you install a brand new installation of Process Director, and this may not be the best folder to look at. Let's actually go back up to, let's go to the default partition. I'm not entirely sure how I've got that set for that default partition folder, but I think it's, yes, it's the default that comes with Process Director, which is what I thought. That permissions folder I monkeyed around with and created permissions. So that doesn't show me what I would actually see when I first install Process Director. By default, when you install Process Director, there is a group called All Authenticated Users, which is to say everyone who has a Process Director user account, whether that is a built-in account an account that is created as a Windows account automatically via Windows SSO, whether it is a Windows account that is synchronized with Active Directory, or whether it is a SAML account that is created whenever you log into your federated identity / SAML system to get onto the system. Every user that has an identity on the system, Windows, SAML, or built-in, it doesn't matter. They are considered an authenticated user because they have to authenticate in some way, either via Windows Active Directory, Windows itself, or via SAML, or with a built-in account to manually log into Process Director. They all have to authenticate, which means that their identity can be positively verified. Thus, they become a member of the All Authenticated Users group. And by default, all authenticated users have access to everything. Your job as a system administrator is to limit the access that users get to different items or different objects in your content list. And you have to set those permissions appropriately. So all permissions are set on a permissions tab on either an object or a folder, and generally a folder in Process Director. When I say that Process Director has a permissive access model, what that means is if I have multiple rules, multiple permissions rules, and this is, by the way, a permissions rule. It says all authenticated users have view, modify, delete, run, view children, modify children, and delete children permission in this folder of Process Director, this folder being the default partition. If I have a conflicting rule for all authenticated users, in fact, I could create one. In fact, I'm not going to create one right now, though. That's what the permissions folder is for, so that I don't start playing around with the permissions of my entire installation. So let's go back to our permissions folder and let's look at the permissions there. So here again, I have all authenticated users. Now, in this case, the all authenticated users group has no view permission for this object, which means they can't see this folder in the content list. They can't modify it, delete it, or anything else. I've taken these permissions away. If I were to create, however, a second permissions rule that gave all authenticated users these view, modify, and delete permissions, and don't worry, I'll explain what these permissions actually are in a moment. But I give them a new permission. I now have two all authenticated users permissions rule, one of which gives them access to things and the other of which doesn't. In the permissive access model, if I have two rules for the same user or group of users, the rule that gives the most expansive permissions wins. So basically, with these two rules, let's see, yes, 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 no. Okay, I have one rule where they both say delete children equals no. So no authenticated user, well, no one in the all authenticated users group can delete any child records anywhere in the system. However, because one of these two records has a yes for everything else, the most permissive rule wins if there is a conflict, which basically means that all authenticated users with this setup and these two conflicting rules, it means that given the most expansive permissions, they can do everything on the system except for deleting child objects on the system. Everything else, they have full permissions to. That's how permissive access works. I am, however, going to delete one of these permissions records. There is another model of access, which is called the denial model. And we'll talk about it, and then we'll get it out of the way, and then we'll never speak of it again because you very rarely need to use it. In fact, it takes a little bit of effort to even implement it. And that's called the denial model. There is a way where you can put the system into denial mode to use denial permissions. It has to be done via a custom variable. That custom variable is called, I think it's F allow deny permissions, but I'm not sure. And I forgot to look up the exact name of the system variable. So we'll go here, and where's denial? Deny permissions. Yes, it is the F enable deny permissions custom variable. F, and oh no, I may have moved it without moving that. All right, fine. I may not have updated a link. F allow deny permissions. It's in here somewhere. Oh, F enable deny permissions. Well, I didn't even get that right. So let's do a quick search for that so we can actually see where it is in the documentation. That is in administration custom variables, F enable deny permissions. I have to set this custom variable to true in my custom vars file for the system to allow denial permissions to be used. Now, there is a reason why we have turned off F enable deny permissions by default. You rarely need specific denial permissions. What denial permissions allow you to do is to choose a specific object. And rather than say, okay, give this person permission to do A, B, and C, and don't give them permission to do anything else. And they'll always be able to do A, B, and C because you've given them the permission to do so. What denial permissions enable you to do is to say, okay, I want this person to have A, B, and C permissions on this form generally, and the permissions will be automatically inherited if it's a form, for example, and I create a form instance. As we'll see in a minute, all instances, all child objects inherit the permissions of their parent object, which means in a form instance, that person will have A, B, and C permissions as well. But let's say that I'm at a law firm and we are representing a client who is suing one of our lawyer's sisters. Okay, we're not going to want to let that particular lawyer do anything with that case. So we're going to need to implement a deny permission on that instance for that lawyer so that whether he wishes to recuse himself or not, he cannot have any access to the work that we're doing for our client who is suing his sister. And by implementing deny permissions, every time someone tries to open that form or a form instance based on that form or one of the documents attached to that form, Process Director will have to do a check to be sure that that person is not on the deny list. Denial permissions are expensive because I now have to create a list of denials. And every time anyone opens up any object in the system, not only do I have to do the normal permissions check, but I also have to do a denial check, essentially what I guess you could think of as a debarment check to ensure that they have not been specifically denied permission to that object. If you have a small system where there's only 4 or 5 users, you probably don't care about it. If you have a large system with 1,000 users who are opening 1,000 forms an hour, you probably don't want to implement deny permissions unless you really, really need them. In almost every normal use case, except for these weird cases where I have to recuse somebody from a particular form, or I have to deny someone specifically access to some specific object. Those are pretty edge use cases. You don't need them very often. Normal permissions generally work for everything that you need to use on a day-to-day basis. So you don't want to enable deny permissions, because even if you don't have any deny permissions set, there's an entire process that has to be gone through every time an object opens to check all of the denial permissions that might exist anywhere in the system to see if one of those denial permissions applies to that object. It is an unwieldy system. It is very expensive in terms of system resources, so you don't want to turn it on by default. You should know that it exists, but you should also never use it unless you have a specific need to do so. In most other cases, the normal permission setting using permissions, the permissive access model, is perfectly fine for you. But I do want you to remember, because of permissive access, we can make some conflicts here, and we can do it inadvertently without realizing it, about which more in due course. Let's talk about the permissions themselves. Every object, as I said, can have permissions set on it. So I can set individual permissions on a form, a process timeline, a knowledge view, although I generally don't want to do that. I generally want to set permissions at the folder level. Setting permissions at the folder level means that if I create an object inside that folder, because permissions are inherited, the object that I create will automatically inherit the permissions that are set on the parent object. So we are going to set a permission here that doesn't exist. I think I did that with the admin group. I'm going to go ahead and delete that permission. We'll go ahead and recreate it. So we are back. Well, in fact, let's put the whole thing back to status quo ante. So for a normal process director installation, this will be my default permission schema. And if this is a dev server or a staging server, I probably don't care much. If this is a production server, I probably care a whole lot, because when my production server is installed, these are the permissions that are going to be on my default, in this case, the folder that contains all of the objects in this partition, the default partition on the system. So because permissions are inherited, every time I create a new object on this system, these are the permissions it's going to inherit, which is basically to allow everyone to do all the things. We may not want that to be our normal permission set. In point of fact, we might want to edit this permission so that we don't give view, modify, or delete permission to everyone. In fact, we probably don't want to give delete children, maybe not even modify children. View children, maybe. It depends on how expansive we want our permission system to be. Technically, we could lock down our production server so that users only have run permission, which means that they can run and they can submit a form, but they don't have permission to do anything else. Now, obviously, I'm going to have to give other permissions to process participants if I do that, but it may be that on a production system, and forgive me, I can't give you specifics about how you should set up your permission schema on your production server. That's something that we'd probably want to have a very detailed discussion with you about in terms of the amount of freedom that you want your end users to have on that server. But if I was to do the most restrictive thing possible, what I would do is I would give all authenticated users only run permissions. So in the normal course of events, a authenticated user could open up a new form instance and could submit it, because that gets covered in the run permission. And after that, they can do nothing else. They have no other permissions on the system. Now, obviously, that's not going to work long term because, yeah, it's great that they can submit forms, but what happens when they get assigned a task in a process timeline? There's certain things that they're going to need to be able to do. So I might choose another class of users, process users. And remember, process users is a dynamic class. Everyone who has an active task assigned to them that they have to complete becomes a process user until that task is completed, in which case they're no longer a process user. Well, there's a couple of things I'm going to need process users to be able to do. Whether they view or modify or delete, no, they don't need to do any of that because view, modify, and delete gives them access to the content list itself. So view is a permission that determines whether that user can actually view the content list, whether they can actually see the folders, whether this thing over here on the left-hand side of the screen will actually show them anything. Because if they don't have view permissions, they don't get to see the content list or any object that is in the content list. Similarly, modify and delete permissions. Modify enable you to edit, and delete permissions enable you to remove content list objects from the content list. Generally, we don't want all users to be able to view, modify, or delete the content list. So for process users, we don't want to give them those permissions either. The run permissions might be necessary, or they might not, depending on what you're specifically doing in the system. Actually, you'd never need to give them run permissions if all authenticated users already have run permissions because they've already got that permission. Everyone, by virtue of having a process director account, has run permission. So even though there may be circumstances in which I do want process users, participants in a process, to be able to run, like perhaps create second forms off of an initial form. Sure, fine, but they're already covered under all authenticated users, so I don't have to give them that permission again. They already have it under existing permissions rule. And I certainly don't want to give them delete children. Well, maybe I do and maybe I don't. I think as a default, I don't want to give anyone delete children permissions because I don't want them to be able to, for example, delete a form instance. But will they need to delete perhaps a document attachment? Maybe they will, in which case I might need to give them delete children permission. I don't know. That's an iffy question. It really depends on what applications you have. And the nice thing is that if I do need to give them delete permission or delete children permission for a particular application, even if in general I don't give them that permission, I can give them that permission for that specific application folder and for all of the objects in that application folder, while for all other folders on the system, their default would not be to delete children. So I think if I'm looking at default permissions, which if we pretend that we are setting these permissions at the root of our partition, I think I probably would skip delete children. What I really can't skip is view children and modify children, because they do need to be able to view form instances in most cases, because form instances are the child objects of the form definition where these permissions are set. And therefore, they need to be able to view those objects, the form instances, so that they can participate in the process. And they probably need to modify children, which would enable them to edit or change the data that exists on a form instance. So I'm probably going to need to give them modify children properties as well. If we're talking about the default properties, I think that's all I need to give them. And I can just click add new permissions. And now I've got a pretty tight permissions schema by default. Again, we're pretending that we are setting our default partition here. Not that we're setting a subfolder, even though we are. So all authenticated users can run an object, and all process participants can view children, form and timeline instances, and document attachments. They can modify those children, but they can't delete them. So this gives me a nice restrictive basis on a production system to ensure that nobody basically can do anything other than submit forms and participate in processes. Now, I probably have a group called, I've got system administrators, and those system administrators can do anything they want. I've got partition administrators. They, like system administrators, are exempt from these permissions. They can do anything they want. So I probably, assuming I have my system administrators and trusted partition administrators set properly, I probably don't need to do anything else for permissions on this system. On the other hand, I may have implementers who I want them to have access to the content list, but I don't want them to have too much access to the content list. But I might have some super user group or whatever. We'll just call it administrators, because I don't think I have a particular super user group like power users or super users. I don't think I have groups like that. I don't. I do have admin, which is kind of dumb in this case because everybody in admin is a system administrator. So, okay, CCS admin carriers. I don't know what group that is, but hey, it exists. So I have these carrier administrators or whatever it is. I have that group. Now I can give that group some extra permissions. So I might want people who are in that group to view or modify content list objects, and perhaps they are the administrators of applications. And so they're going to be going in and doing application administration. That may mean making some changes to objects that exist in the content list, making edits to form definitions or timeline definitions because maybe they need to correct some misconfiguration. And they may also be administrators of the process in terms of correcting errors that may occur for a process that's in error or something like that. And so they may need to go in and change some data or whatever it is that they may need to do as they administer running processes. So I might give this specific group the ability to view and modify content list objects and to view and modify their children, but not to delete those objects. So they don't get to delete anything, and they can't delete children. In general, on a production system, only system administrators and partition administrators should be allowed to delete anything. Everybody else who has some permissions level below that, you can certainly give them modify permissions and modify children permissions, but in general, you don't want to give them delete permissions. So delete and delete children off the table. Run unnecessary. Again, remember, all authenticated users already have run permissions. I don't have to re-give the same permission to another user. So for this specific group, this specific administrative group, they now have some extra permissions that will allow them to view and to modify both content list objects and their children. These are probably the three main use cases on a production system that you would set up on a default. And I think the third case with this group is probably optional in most cases. I think most organizations set a certain number of people as their system admins or partition admins, and those people do all of the management of processes that are running on their system. But we do have some cases where the people who administer the system and the people who administer processes, the application admins, to make up a term, they need some different permissions because you don't want to give them full administrative access to the system. Yet at the same time, they do need to be able to work and modify and manage the running applications that you might have on your system. So if that happens to be the paradigm under which you operate, then you would need this third set of permissions to enable this limited editing and control of the content list so that they could edit objects, move them around as needed. And the only thing that you wouldn't allow them to do is delete. This is probably as expansive a set of permissions as most production systems need. And now that I've set these permissions, I do want to save them as part of this folder. As I said earlier, permissions are inherited. So if I just go ahead and close my permissions folder, now that I've created permissions on it, and I go back into it, I want to look at two things. First thing, I want to create a folder. We'll just create a folder and we'll just call this, well, I meant to call it perms test. Now what have I done? I clearly have hit F12 or F11 and everything has gone higgledy-piggledy. So let's try to correct my spelling here. Perms test, and we'll hit OK. And I now have this new folder called perms test. And while we're in this new folder, let's go ahead and check its permissions. The permissions for perm test are the same as the permissions that are granted in the permissions folder that we just configured because of inheritance. And so anytime I create any object anywhere now in the permissions folder, so we'll just create a, well, let's create a process timeline so that we don't have to open it up in design view. And we'll just call this test TL. And we'll look at its permissions tab because every object in Process Director has a permissions tab. Although for some reason it doesn't seem to want to show me this permissions tab. Let's create an activity. Let's update it. And are we waiting to show me the permissions tab? What are we doing? Will it show me any tab? Not sure. There we go. Not sure why the system wasn't responding there for a second, but this is the permissions of this process timeline definition. And of course, these are the permissions that were inherited for that timeline definition. Now, I do want you to notice that when I set the items on my permissions folder, there was already a pre-existing folder in here. It's called item actions. Let's look at that folder. And well, let's just look at the folder properties for that particular folder. And the permissions on item actions are different. These are the permissions that existed prior to me going through and specifying what the different permission options were for me on this particular server. The reason that these are different is because, well, they inherited the permissions that existed at the time that these objects were created. Those permissions are all different now. However, changing the permissions on the parent object, while it does ensure that once changed, any new objects created will inherit the permissions that existed at the time of their creation, will not change the status of existing objects. To do that, I would need to replicate my permissions down to the object. So if we look at the objects themselves, so we're just looking at the item actions folder, it has these permissions. And if I go down a couple of levels, let's just go to the form instances for this particular that are in this particular folder, and I take a look at this specific form instance, and I open the properties for this form instance, I will see the same permissions that existed when this form instance was created. This is perfectly normal. This is what we would expect to happen on the system. Which means if I go in and change permissions, and we'll just use our perms test folder because I don't want to reset these permissions, nor do I actually want to apply them to any of the objects here for reasons that will become obvious a bit later. If I go into this permissions folder and I change its permissions, right? So let's just get rid of this, this extra permission for these notional application administrators. And so now I'm back to just 2 permissions record for this folder. As I just explained, now that I've done that, if I go into the perms test folder and I reopen my perms test timeline, it will have the old permissions listed here. Similarly, if I was to run this timeline, and let's just run it and get rid of it real quick. So I didn't want to create an activity. Let me remove this activity. And rather than making this a user activity, I'm going to make this an end process activity. So this is going to be a super short timeline to run. And I'm going to hit OK, and I'm going to run this process timeline. Do I want to start it? Yes, I do. Process has been started. That's great. Let's go back to perms test. Let's give her another run just for good measure. That process has been started. And now if we look way down here at the bottom of my content list, I should have nothing in active timelines because they should have started and stopped immediately. I have 2 timeline instances. And if we open one of the properties for those timeline instances, and again, go to its permissions tab, I can see these 2 properties assigned to this particular process timeline. So notice it's got CCS admin carriers group still in it, even though if we go back up to perms test, I got to go there to get to perms test. I have completely different permissions set. So my instance is inheriting permissions that are still set on the process timeline definition. Even though they're changed here in my folder. So I'm inheriting my test TL permissions in my completed timeline, with one exception. It doesn't have all authenticated users thrown in there because permissions, not all permissions, are relevant to all objects. Some permissions just simply don't apply to all objects. This is a process timeline instance. Now, I can run a process timeline definition. And when I run a process timeline definition, as I did twice, it creates the timeline instances for me, and the timeline instances go through whatever process they go through. What I cannot do to a timeline instance is run it. There is no effective run action for a timeline instance. I can only run the the timeline definition. Because there is no such thing as a run property, it just gets rid of the all authenticated users. That's the only thing that they can do, and it's not a relevant permission for this particular object. I can't run a PDF file. I can't run a Word document or an Excel spreadsheet. Not all permissions are applicable to all objects. So you will see some differences sometimes in the objects based on what those different permissions do at different times. Although I am just about to blow all of this away and change it all, because when I go in and change my perms test permissions, and I come up with these two permissions as the desired permissions, but I've already got existing objects inside these perms test folders. And not only that, but each of these objects now has their own child objects, their own instances. Well, now I got to figure out, what do I do with all of those existing items? Now, happily, that's not difficult to do, because I have two replication buttons down here at the bottom of my permissions list. One, which allows me to replicate these current permissions to all of the child objects, which is to say all of the content list objects that are a child of this object. And this is where the discussion of parent and child objects gets a little fuzzy. So we have to have a brief discussion about that. In terms of the content list, the contents of a folder are considered its children. And so when we look at the permissions, I have the ability to change its child objects, which is to say, if I was to replicate two child objects, technically there is only one child object in this folder, which is the test.tl process timeline definition. That's the only content list object that is a child of the permissions test. But we have all these completed timelines that do appear to exist as children of this timeline definition. And that is true. The completed and active timelines are technically child items. I'm not going to say objects because that's going to get confusing syntactically. So let's consider them child items of this timeline definition. What we call them are instances. So they're not child objects of the timeline. They are child instances of the timeline. So they are not content list object children. They are object instance children. And that is an important distinction to make. And because of that distinction, if we go back to our replication buttons, that's why I have two of them. Clicking the first button will replicate permissions to the child content list objects, or in this case, object, the test.tl. That will be the only object that changes. So let's add some, well, they already have different permissions, right? So let's just replicate the current permissions to the child objects. In fact, let's make it a little more interesting. Let's create a form. And it doesn't really matter what the form name is. We'll create the timeline test form. We'll hit OK. I don't really care about any form fields. I don't need any. What I do need to do is start the test timeline when I submit the form. Again, we don't really care about content here. What we really care about or any actions that take place in terms of processes, that we don't care about that. We're only concerned with permissions in this case. So we will set this to test.tl to automatically start that test. And now I'm going to have different permissions, I think, because I changed my perms test folder. So I'm going to go ahead and update, and we'll take a look at what the permissions are here, which I think are going to be different than yes, they are going to be different than the timeline. I still have my run permissions, right? But none of the other permissions are there because I removed those extra permissions. So now if I go in, and we're just going to run this a couple of times to create a couple of instances. I just want them to exist. And we'll do one more for good measure. Okay, so now we can go into our timeline. We can see our test form. We already know what those permissions were. We saw them a few moments ago. We can go into our form instances, and we can look at the properties of our form instances. And obviously they have, those permissions because, again, form instances, you don't run them. You run the definition to create the form instance. But okay, that's fine. I've got all these permissions here. They're all different from what's on Perms test. So on Perms test, I'm going to want to make some changes here. And I clicked on the wrong thing, apparently. This is where I want to be. I want to make some changes here. So we will add, let's just add a group back. So let's add that CCS admin carriers, and let's just give them some view, modify, and delete permissions on the objects. And well, we also want to take care of the instances as well. So let's give them everything here except run. Again, we don't need to give them run permissions because everybody already has that. I do want you to notice one thing, however. Notice that I can't uncheck these properties. I can uncheck this property. And now that I've unchecked that property, I still can't uncheck view children, but I can uncheck modify children. And then once I've unchecked modify children, I can uncheck view children. Conversely, if I go through and click delete children, it's going to give me everything. Why is it going to do that? If I pick a more powerful permission, a more expansive permission, all of the lesser permissions get included automatically. Basically, this is a hierarchy of power that you give to people on your system. If I'm allowed to delete children, then I must necessarily have the permission to modify them. And if I have permission to modify child objects, then obviously that must include the permission to look at the children. So I must have view children properties as well. So applying a more expansive property always automatically grants any less expansive property to that particular object. So if I hit delete or delete children, it's going to give me all of the other properties as well. So I can add that new permission to my CCS carriers group. And let's just add one more. I've got another group called finance. And let's say finance, I don't want them to do anything with the child records, but I do want to give them control over the content list. I don't know why I want to have finance control my content list, but I do apparently. And so now I've got these records. I'm pretty happy with this. I can update it. But again, remember, I've created these records. They don't exist, these permissions records, on any of these objects in the content list. So my timeline, my form, all of my instances, they still have the old permissions. If I only want to update the parent objects, I can just replicate the current permissions to all child objects only. So I've done that permission. It's been replicated to the children. So let's take a look. If we go to our test timeline, well, there's all my new properties. I'm happy there. Let's go to my completed timelines. And let's look at their properties. Now we're back to where we were originally. We did not give those permissions to the instances. We only gave them to the objects. So if I also want to apply those permissions to the instances as well, which you might very well want to, especially if you're, changing something that fundamentally affects who gets to look at and edit the instances, then clicking the replicate button isn't going to work for you. In that case, you're going to need to replicate current permissions to all child objects and instances. And that will give us a more complete turnover. So if we go now into our completed timelines or our completed form and we look at its properties, okay, I've got my CCS admin carriers group in there. That's good. If I go to the form instances, I've got the appropriate properties associated with those form instances. Again, not all properties are applicable to all objects. So some things are going to be different, but at least I have my CCS admin group here who now have the view, modify, and delete permission on this particular object. So the way that we set those permissions is important. All right, let's take a look at one thing that we can do, however, that kind of blows this up a little bit. And you can do it without realizing that you're messing up your permission schema. I have this little application right here, and it has a form and a timeline, and it doesn't do much. If I run it, there's a form. It allows me to upload a document. And so we'll browse for a document. So I don't want to browse for a document in there. So let's go to desktop and doc, which is where all of my sample documents are stored. And we'll pick office security.pdf and we'll upload that document to our form. There we go. Office security, it's associated. I'll go ahead and submit that form and it's going to go away. Why do I have this? What does it do? Because it doesn't look very interesting. And it doesn't look interesting, but it is interesting. There is one custom task that you need to be very careful about using. And that custom task is the item actions custom task. Because this custom task gives you the permission to, or gives you the ability to set permissions on objects. Well, I didn't mean to collapse that. I meant to highlight it, but there we go. It's this permissions section right here. I can set my own permissions technically on every object, irrespective of what partitions are set on the rest of the system. So in this particular case, with this custom task, I have now given anonymous users view permission to my content list. I'm not sure exactly how that would work out or how anonymous users would get to the system to see anything, but technically, and I'm setting it to anonymous users because in the real world, anonymous users could never do this. But I do want anonymous users to have a permission, so I've given them view permission. I've chosen set permissions manually, and I have said, okay, we are going to have some timeline references. We're going to have some documents. And some of these documents are going to be in the PDF group. And if I have a document and it's in the PDF group, I'm going to set some special permissions for it. I'm going to set anonymous users get to view the object. Now, as a practical matter, I don't know how they would do it because I don't know how they'd get to the object with the permission schema that I have now, but that's not important. What is important is that I can now mess with the schema that I have built into my system via the item actions custom tasks specifically. So I can kind of go hog wild here if I want to and create my own crazy little permission schema for every single document. You have that power as an application designer. And what that means as a practical matter is if I go into this timeline and I shouldn't have any active timelines. No, we'll go into completed timeline. We'll go into this one that I just created. We'll go into its properties. Okay, this has the old permissions that we had because I didn't replicate any new permissions to this folder intentionally. So that's what we would expect to see. Let's go to our timeline items. We got a couple of items. We have our form and we have our Office Security PDF, which is in the PDF group. So if I click on the checkbox and I go to its properties, there is my anonymous users property. I have now added an anonymous users property via a CT that doesn't exist anywhere in my schema. In fact, I don't think I have anything anywhere. That's not true. I do have a couple of applications on here where I do take anonymous submissions from the internet. For example, the NPS survey that I mailed out to you a few weeks ago. That is an anonymous form. But other than that, and also the document feedback form. The document feedback that's at the bottom of every documentation page. You click a button, it opens up a little document feedback form. That's an anonymous form that's also stored on this server. Both of those applications run from this server. Other than that, I have no anonymous users anywhere. And you generally don't set anonymous users unless you really, really want it. With the Item Actions custom task, I have now blown up my system and given it a permission schema that I may or may not want. So you should be aware that Item Actions custom task will allow you to degrade your own security and process director. Obviously, you have to specifically configure it to do that. And we're going to trust you that if you specifically do that, that's what you want to do. By the way, since we talked about anonymous users, and I didn't really talk about them much when we were talking about permissions because it is a more rare use case. But now that I've said it and I've brought it up and I've talked about two applications that actually have it, well, I guess we got to talk about it. In most cases, you don't want anonymous users to access your system. Authenticated users, yeah, sure. You want authenticated users too, but you do have this one group here that we haven't talked about, anonymous users. Any user that does not have a process director account and thus do not authenticate with the system are considered anonymous users. Our engineers are sticklers for details, so they prefer the use of two terms, anonymous users and unauthenticated users. Technically, you can have a form that is open to anonymous users, which means people I have no idea who they are. And let's take a look at one such form. So we'll go into this NPS survey documentation feedback. This is a form that's available to all of you. I created this many, many years ago in a completely different process director server, actually. So I've had it updated. So the last time it was updated was in 2022, in January of 2022. And this is my document feedback form. We don't really care about the form itself. We care about its properties and we care about its permissions specifically. So anonymous users on this form can do a couple of things. They can run this form. They can view its children, modify its children. They can't delete its children. Actually, they don't even need view and modify children because they don't really participate in a process at all. So technically, those two permissions are not necessary. However, in order to submit this form, which, as I said, is at the bottom of every documentation page, you got this big blue button here. And if you click it, it opens this form. Now, it will not open anonymously for me because I'm already logged into the system. It knows who I am. So when this form pops up, it's already going to know who I am. But this is the anonymous form. And basically, it asks two questions. And other than, I think, the feedback itself, they're largely optional. But this form does have something on it that I think it's important to talk about, and it's an email address. So I have the ability to put an email address on this form and then enter my feedback. Now, the only thing that this particular application does is it sends me an email that says I got a documentation feedback. That's all it does. But this please enter an email address field here. If I was to enter an email here, I would technically no longer be an anonymous user. I would be an unauthenticated user, which is to say I still don't have a Process Director account, but I'm not anonymous. I'm not some faceless stranger. You now have at least an email address to which I can treat as a quasi identity. So if I have that email address, I can assign tasks to anonymous users via email address. And you, as the anonymous, well, the formerly anonymous user, but now because you've given me an email address, you're not technically an unauthenticated user. I can now send emails to you, and those emails can include task notifications. And with those task notifications, you can actually reopen the form and make edits to it and change it and do whatever else is required as part of completing your task, after which you ultimately would click the whatever completion buttons would appear at the bottom of the form. And so you can participate as an unauthenticated user. Technically, you're not anonymous because you have provided an email address. So we at least have one piece of identifying data that lets us know who we think you are. We think you are because you're still not authenticated, but you're not really fully anonymous at that point. At the point you click this, you're anonymous. If you provide an email address and you are a task participant, technically you're no longer anonymous. Technically you're unauthenticated, even though really the only thing we know about you is that you gave us an email address, which we presume works, but we don't actually know that for sure. So we don't know if we can really contact you. And by the way, when we send out this task notification to you, we'll still treat you as an anonymous user. In fact, we'll still call you an anonymous user because you could forward that task email to your brother-in-law and they could go in and complete your task with the link that gets provided, because I can't force you to authenticate in any way because I don't really know your identity. I have one piece of information that allows me to communicate with you, but I can't confirm you are who you are. So if I send you that email from that anonymous form, well, you can forward the email that this will send you to literally anyone you like. And because this form has anonymous user permission, that person could just click on the link and this form would be perfectly happy to open up and allow them to edit it to their heart's content. So anonymous users are not secure. I think that's probably a pretty obvious proposition. If you let someone you don't know access your system, you can't ensure its security. That is true. So by being able to go in and give anonymous users permissions, as I did here in my process timeline, you could conceivably create a security hole in your system by using the item actions custom task and allowing anonymous users to do things. Now, look, there are other safeguards in the system. For an anonymous user, obviously, first of all, they can't even see your content list. They don't have an identity. So they have no workspace. So without a workspace, they can't access anything. So this is not really going to be particularly hurtful. The worst thing that could possibly happen is that if the object had an accessible URL, which in this case it does, it's a PDF file. it actually has a download URL. And if I happened as an anonymous user to know what that URL was, which of course would also require that I know what the GUID is for that object. But assuming I knew all of that, I mean, technically, if I knew the URL, I could put it into my browser and I could open it and I could look at this PDF file. That's the worst thing that can happen here. But if I have authenticated users that might be interested in, doing some things that I don't want them to do, that would open up by using that item actions custom task, that could open up a security hole that would allow an authenticated user, because, I set anonymous users here. And that's probably not going to cause any major heartache for an anonymous user to get into your system and do anything. Technically, you shouldn't be setting that permission, but the other obstacles for an anonymous user to get to your system and do anything are pretty tall. However, what if I was to give the process user view, modify, and delete permission to the content list? Then for the time that they have an active task assigned to them, they can technically, they could access the content list. Now, we have some other UI things that, prevent people from seeing the content list, like properties in the user admin area. So there are still bars that have to be jumped over to get to that. But technically, you could set those permissions and give someone view, modify, and delete permission to your content list. I did it with all anonymous users. That's going to be pretty safe in almost any context here, because the only thing they're getting access to is a PDF file. At the end of the day, who cares? They aren't going to be able to get to that PDF file anyway, because they need to know what the GUID is that was created when it was loaded onto the system. They'll never know that. They'll never guess it. So they'll never access it. No, I don't care. But once I start getting into process users, those are probably all authenticated users. If I select a specific user or select a specific group, I'm going to give them full access. And so you need to do this for the item actions custom tasks. There's a couple of good reasons why it does that. You need to be aware that the item actions custom tasks exist, and it gives people access to the system that you don't necessarily want them to have. There's also another little wrinkle here for permissions that is important to talk about. Kind of going through my notes here to be sure that I cover everything. Let's go into user administration. And let's just pick a user. Let's just pick, I don't know, one of the test users, Eric. So here's Eric Wintemute. He is my user. He's also a system partition admin and a system configuration admin. I'm going to remove him from that because configuration admin doesn't, but partition admin gives him an exemption to permissions. So I'm going to go ahead and remove that and update it. He's in a couple of groups. All users let's look at what groups he's in. All users. He's an admin because I find it easy. He's an admin to use him as a sample. So fine. He's got claims, file clerk, and training groups. Assuming that I have permissions on certain applications for clerks or training or file admin or whatever it may be, what happens when Eric leaves? Well, I can go here and I can replace this user with some other user. So I can replace Eric with Barb, say. I'm not gonna, because I use him in a couple of places. But if I replace this user with Barb Stanley and I click replace this user now, if there are any permissions records anywhere in the system, a folder, a form, whatever it may be, where I have given an explicit permission to Barb Stanley, or I'm sorry, to Eric. When I replace Eric with Barb Stanley, all of those permissions that were granted specifically to Eric anywhere in the system will now also be granted to Barb. So replacing a user with another user also replaces all of the permissions that have been granted to them, and they automatically get granted to the other user. I think that's how we would want this to run, obviously, because if, Eric leaves and I have to replace him with Barb, I'm going to want to be able to replace those permissions. I don't want to be in the business of going through all of these folders in this content list and trying to figure out where Eric has been granted a permission. I want that to happen for me automatically. Now, some things that won't affect permissions that are important to cover. Let's go back to my permissions folder. Let's go back to my perms test. And I'm going to move my perms test. And I'm going to hit move. And I'm going to move my perms tests to archive, at least temporarily. So we'll go to the archive folder and we'll move our perms test folder there. So there we go. There it exists. By the way, since we're here in the archive folder, let's look at its permissions. All authenticated users. Good. We're happy. Let's look at the permissions for, oops, somehow I've gone up one folder level more than I wanted to. So let's go into perms test and let's look at its permissions, and it pulled its permissions with it. So anytime I move, those permissions are going to go. It is not going to erase and re-inherit the permissions of existing objects. So everything in the perms test folder is going to have the same permissions that it had prior to my moving it. We're not really, of course, moving anything. The only thing that happens whenever we move an object, and it looks like we moved it, right? It looks like we moved it into the archive folder. And indeed, if I go back to the archive folder and I click on perms test and I hit move again, and I go back into my permissions folder, which is where I actually want it, and I hit move here, it looks like it moves the folder. What's actually happening in the background is we are changing a database record, one field. In fact, we are changing the parent ID for this folder. And that's all we're doing. And so the parent ID for this folder is now whatever the ID is for the permissions folder. When I moved it, we just changed its parent ID to the archive folder, and then we changed it back. All we're doing is making a change. We're not creating anything, and thus inheritance does not apply. Now, if you were to use copy, that would in fact change the permissions. So if we go into permissions test and we make a copy of permissions test, and then we go into archive and we copy here, it's a folder. Merg. I hate it when it does that. That's training archive. Okay, fine. Perms test, so fine. We'll go into perms test. We'll grab copy. All right, what's happening here? Oh, cancel copy. Now we can copy, and we'll go back here. I'm not sure why it didn't grab that folder, but I'm honestly not interested in doing the troubleshooting or figuring out what it was that I did wrong. So we'll just go ahead and copy here because it doesn't matter what we copy. We'll go to it, properties. And it's back to all authenticated user. When you copy, you're actually creating a new version, or literally a copy of an existing object. And because you're creating the object inside whatever you say your copy location is, as the object gets created, it is going to inherit whatever the permissions are for its parent object. It's, in this case, it's a timeline, so its parent object will be a folder, in this case, the archive folder. So it will inherit the permissions that are set on the archive folder. Moving, however, does not, because all we're doing is changing the location of your parent. So if you move an object, then if you want the permissions to change, then what you're probably going to have to do is go into the parent properties and go to the properties tab of the parent object, in this case, the archive folder, and you're going to need to replicate those permissions down again. Like the copy function, which doesn't export permissions because it creates objects de novo in just a different location, exporting objects from a system does not carry across their permissions as well. As soon as you export an object, permissions are stripped. So if I go into here and I go to my perms test and I click export, and okay, and it's going to want me to do a save as perms test.pdz. And now in that PDZ file that I just saved, my permissions have been stripped. So if I go to my other server, the documentation server, and log in as me, and we'll go to my content list here, and documentation, training, and we import our objects. Spinny is running. Let's give her a second. Okay, come on. A little ridiculous here. Finally, let's browse for our object. This is going to be in downloads, obviously, and perms test.pdz. We'll import it. Import was successful. I knew it'd be nice and quick. So there's my perms test. While we're here, let's see what my permissions are. They're going to be pretty basic. I think it's going to be all authenticated users do everything. And if I go into my perms test folder or anything in the perms test folder, these objects were, once again, basically by importing them, I'm creating these objects de novo on this second system documentation. And thus they will import, or they will inherit the properties of whatever folder into which I import them. Now, that's actually a pretty cool thing, because what I'm probably going to want to do on occasion is let's pretend that documentation is my deb server, which actually is not entirely untrue. So on my deb server, I've now created these objects. I've gone in, I've had to do something. I've made some sort of change to the object. In fact, let's make some sort of change to the object just to be sure that we have the right thing so that we prove this is happening. So I'll have my create activity here, and I actually want to make that object dependent. So I'm going to want to change the order in which they occur. Come on, let me change the order. There we go. So this is no longer activity one. We'll just call this, we'll give it a name. How about that? We'll name things properly. We'll just call it end. And activity, well, you know what? If I'm just going to change the name, I don't even need this activity. Let me just remove this activity. So all I did is change the name. It was called activity 1. That's clearly wrong. It needs a real name. So I've changed the name of the activity to end. Great. So now my permissions test has been changed a bit. It's slightly different. So I am now going to export it again, and we'll call it perms test. I'll just overwrite my original perms test. Yes, I do want to replace it. There we go. I've replaced it. We'll go back over here to training server, and I will import objects, and I will pick that PDZ file. Again, we'll import it. The import process will run happily quite quickly. If we go into our perms test process timeline, we can see this has now been updated. So I did import and export it correctly. I now have an updated version. Oh, and by the way, it re-inherited the permissions of the folder. This eliminates one big worry whenever we're working on two separate servers, a development server, and then we're importing into staging. Because permissions are stripped automatically whenever you do the export, that means that whenever you do the import, whatever folder you choose, you can expect your permissions inheritance to work exactly the way that you expect it to work when you import a new version of, in this case, an entire application. Everything is just going to inherit whatever the permissions are in the parent folder, and I don't have to worry about those permissions on an ongoing basis, which is, by the way, another reason why A, we have a parent folder for all of our applications, and B, why we have a set permissions schema to ensure that we have the appropriate permissions on our production system. To reiterate what that should be, because I've created several extra permissions here, let's delete that. And this is something more or less what a production system would look like. Note I said more or less, and I did not say make your system look like this. As I said at the outset, we would need to talk to you if you wanted to have a tight permission schema and you had some questions about how that might be implemented. We'd obviously want to talk to you about the different things that are going on in your system before we gave you any recommendations formally about what your permission schema would look like. But as a starting point, this is probably relatively close. Although keep in mind, this is about as restrictive as you could possibly get. Whether you want to be that restrictive is up to you, and whether we would recommend that you be this restrictive would be something that we would want to talk about and consult with you about. That is, however, about all I can tell you when it comes to permissions. And I did manage to go for an hour and a half, so I think I talked longer about permissions than I planned to, and perhaps longer than you wanted me to. For those of you who are here today, however, I thank you for being here, and I look forward to seeing you again on Tuesday for the Feature Spotlight webinar, and then again, of course, next Thursday for the training webinar. Have a great weekend. I'll look forward to talking to you again next week. So long.